Hello, I'm Mark Richards, and this is going to be a presentation on the theories of cognitive development and learning. This presentation aims to discuss experiments supporting Piaget's view on cognitive development, contrasting theories to Piaget's view, classical and operant conditioning, and behaviourist techniques in the classroom. Firstly, we need to look at some of the common terms in learning theory. To fully understand these learning theories, some definitions need explanation, and examples of these, some of these, will be discussed later. Classical conditioning is where a neutral stimulus is paired with an instinctive response to another stimulus. After repetition of the process, the neutral stimulus becomes conditioned and gives the same response as an instinctive response. Extinction is the idea that a learned behaviour can be unlearned, and where the conditioned stimulus given without the unconditioned stimulus happens too much and the response ends. Operant conditioning is defined as voluntary behaviour and is usually learned through positive or negative reinforcement managing that behaviour. Positive reinforcement increases likelihood of appropriate behaviour and can come in things such as rewards for appropriate behaviour, which in turn increases that chance of that behaviour being repeated. Negative reinforcement also increases the chance of a behaviour being repeated through removing that negative stimulus that people just don't like. Continuous reinforcement is used to reinforce every correct response or every correct time that there's appropriate behaviour in the classroom to a certain child, but needs to be immediate, and it's usually used when teaching new skills or behaviours to children. Intermittent reinforcement is used to reinforce some of the correct responses they may receive, but not all of them, and it's used to maintain existing good behaviour. Shaping is defined as reinforcing efforts towards targeted behaviours, so basically shaping behaviour of a child to how it should be. Can be negative, does have negative implications. If children feel ignored, they can shape them to act out and change their behaviour in a negative manner. Through Piaget's work, experiments were used to support the theory of learning that he devised, and split into stages of development through the sensory motor stage, pre-operational stage, concrete operational stage, and the formal operational stage. The sensory motor stage starts at birth until around age 2, he argued, and he used this stage to show how children learnt object permanence. The experiment he undertook was hiding the toy while the child was watching, to observe if the child would then search for the toy afterwards. And he assumed that if a child searched for it, then they had a mental representation of that toy. And he found that children around 8 months old would begin to search for this toy, determining that they had mental representation of the toy and therefore object permanence of the toy. But some studies do argue that some of the children may have had no interest in the toy in the first place, they may be easily distracted by other things, or they lack the sufficient motor skills to search. The pre-operational stage, which he said starts at age 2 until around age 7, and he argued that children do not think logically in this stage and used a conservation experiment involving properties such as number, length, mass and volume. The experiment was undertaken using 2 identical pieces of plasticine rolled into balls, and a child at this stage would say that they are the same size. If one of these balls was then rolled into a sausage and the child asked which now had more plasticine, they would say that the sausage was bigger. He argued that through these experiments that he described a child in this stage as perception bound, influenced by what they see and hear around them. They notice state over transformation, so the shape and size of the object over how the object can change through manipulation, centred on one thing at a time, lacked reversibility of an object, so couldn't see that the sausage could be rolled back up into the identical ball, and lack conservation, so the object's properties don't change even though its appearance does. He also argued that children in the pre-operational stage were egocentric in their thinking, and used the Three Mountains experiment, which was a 3D model of 3 mountains with different objects on each of the 3 peaks. The child was given several pictures showing different views of the mountain. A doll was placed at different points around the model, and the child asked to choose which picture they thought the doll could see. Most of the children would only choose pictures of the view that they could see themselves, and he said that this determined that children in the pre-operational stage lacked the ability to decenter from themselves. Margaret Donaldson argued that this experiment was flawed due to the complicated language that he used and that children didn't understand it. She conducted her own study using the same 3 mountains model but hiding a doll from a policeman. She found that most under 7s could complete this task successfully, and 88% of under 3s could also complete this task. Concrete operational stage, Piaget argued that children begin to think logically, they begin to decenter, they reverse, and they conserve successfully. He used an experiment of drawing a glass of water when sat on a table and asking them to draw where the water would be and how it would look. Then he asked them to draw how the water would sit in the glass if the glass was at an angle. He found that children in this stage would draw the line correctly. Again, Margaret Donaldson criticised this work, saying adults deliberately altering objects distorts a child's viewpoint. She conducted her own experiment that found the majority of 4 to 6-year-olds could complete this task easily. The formal operational stage, which says begins adolescence and goes onwards, children systematically test solutions to problems with logical thinking. He used the pendulum test, using different factors like the length of string, the weight of the object, and the force of the push, to see how fast the pendulum swings. He found that children in this stage tested each of the variables systematically and in turn, but he found younger children often tried 2 of the variables at once, proving that they had a lack of logical thinking. Contrasting theories. Piaget's theory does help us understand cognitive development, but can be argued as being flawed as it doesn't explain the transition between stages, any individual difference between children in their cognition, or social-cultural differences between children. Social learning theory, based on the theory that learning happens from observation of others, and the main principles are that learning is a social concept and children learn through modelling, observational learning and imitation. Albert Bandura developed his theory through experiments using a Bobo doll, and observed that children who watched an adult act violently towards the doll would later imitate this behaviour. Socio-cultural theory argues that cognitive growth occurs through observation of someone of higher knowledge. Vygotsky emphasised the social nature of language and the collaborative nature of learning, and used the defined zone of proximal development as the difference between what a child can do for themselves and what is achievable with help and encouragement. Information processing theory describes how children acquire, store and use knowledge, and then compare the brain to a computer, constantly analysing data from around the environment that we're in. Opposite to the behaviourist theory, it argued that humans process information constantly, rather than just responding to an external stimuli. Classical and operant conditioning. We've already covered this slightly in the first part. Ivan Pavlov developed his theory of classical conditioning accidentally while studying dogs and whether their salivating response to food was innate or hardwired. Behaviourists would call this an unconditioned response and is instinctive. Pavlov introduced a neutral stimulus, which was a bell, that rang when giving food to the dogs. After repeating this process a few times, dogs would give the salivating response to the bell even if there was no food given to them. This showed that dogs learnt association between the bell and food, and this would be called a conditioned response. Operant conditioning was developed by Boris Frederick Skinner, using rats within a specifically designed maze for the aim of teaching. Found that if rats went the right way, they were given food as a reward, but if they went the wrong way, they received a small electric shock. It began to show that rats learned which was the right way to go, through positive reinforcement of getting food as the reward. And he concluded that the positive reinforcement strengthened their behaviour, but it also showed how negative reinforcement can have a similar effect, in that when they knew that they were going to get an electric shock, they would purposefully avoid going the wrong way to go the right way. And he said that this was learning to avoid consistent negative reactions. Behaviourist techniques can be extremely useful tools in the classrooms, as we've seen in Skinner's theory of operant conditioning, how important positive reinforcement, encouragement and praise are. Positive reinforcement through body language or positive attention can be a massive motivator to children. This can be simple, as simple as a smile, a compliment on good work, or complimenting appropriate behaviour in the classroom. But it needs to be a consistent approach, and rewarding appropriate behaviour consistently is essential. Sometimes positive reinforcement can come in the form of material rewards. These can be things such as stickers or treats for children. It can be an extremely effective way of managing appropriate behaviour, but does come with the risk of children only displaying appropriate behaviours for the reward that carries. Behavioural charts are another way that positive reinforcement can be used in the classroom. It's an extremely visual guide to let children see how their behaviour is appropriate or inappropriate. And it uses symbols such as stars to display good behaviour on the chart. This is used primarily in an early years setting, where they're trying to influence a child's behaviour, or all children's behaviour, and teach them what is appropriate and inappropriate. But it can also be very useful to children that have a limited grasp of the English language or have special educational needs. Thank you for listening. This was a presentation on the theories of cognitive development and learning.